What's up, everybody? My name is Kodak Zach, and I'm back with more of our Pokemon Draft League. This week we have 3 more exciting games to go over and look through. A lot of fun compositions, a lot of interesting stuff to see, and I'm excited to really share it with you. If you missed our last couple of videos, we had a video that went over the teams, the premise, the ideas, and what kind of everybody was going to be looking like and running with their individual teams. And then last week we looked over our first week of action, some of the exciting starts to the week. Now we're into week 2. We've got 3 more cool games to see, and I'm really excited to share these with you. I think there's a lot of fun stuff to see. So, if that's stuff that you're interested in, feel free to drop a sub, like, comment, etc. All the YouTube stuff. You know how to do it. You've been on this platform long enough. And I'm not going to waste too much of your time. We're just going to hop right in, starting with myself versus Kurairai in the Gemstone Gamers versus Major League Gaming. So for the first game, when I looked across and saw that Ho-Oh did not come this week, I immediately knew that I really liked my Stonehenge Yveltal lead. So that's exactly what I decided to go for in this game 1. And they lead it into Gastrodon Metagross, which I feel like made a very good positive matchup for me. The Gastrodon's not going to be consistently doing any significant damage to Yveltal, and the Metagross is in grave danger from a Max Darkness with both Life Orb boost and Power Spot boost. This Yveltal is doing a crazy amount of damage and can really just kind of blast through the team with a little bit of an advantage if I can get it rolling early. The Stonehenge is running Sash to help it stay on the field a bit longer, and as well as Wide Guard to help it protect. So I liked my options to just keep it here and just let it kind of be a support mon. I was essentially playing a one-spot game at this point, but I liked my chances with the power of the Yveltal in this matchup. So I immediately Dynamax turn 1 and go for the Wide Guard to protect from something like a Blizzard. The Darkness does one-shot the Metagross, and the Gastro is able to hit the Hydro Pump into Stonehenge, so I don't get the Wide Guard boost, but Stonehenge does live on the Sash because of its abysmal special defense stat. It doesn't take it well, but it lives on the Sash. So I end up with a 1-0 lead right off the bat, which I feel like is exactly what I kind of needed in this matchup to be able to help snowball it. This was the one that I felt if I got an early Dynamax and I was able to just kind of run with an early lead in these matchups, I could turn that into a bigger lead down the line. And so that's exactly what I tried to do. So he goes into Calyrex and decides to max it right away as soon as it comes in. I go for the Wide Guard again, expecting something of an Astral Barrage or something, but he goes for Max Darkness in order to try to drop my special defense, make myself a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit easier to take out. But my Max Darkness goes back into him and takes him down to the Sash on his Calyrex, while also dropping the Gastrodon to only halved special defense, meaning that the Yveltal will have a really easy time picking the Gastrodon off once it needs to at the end. Meanwhile, the Gastrodon then again goes into my Stonehenge with Hydro Pump, picks it up. I now do not have my extra boost on the field, but I do have a speed option. Entei with Choice Scarf is very, very fast. It's able to outspeed Calyrex, which is the fastest option that he has. And with Bulldoze, I'm able to pick the Calyrex at 1 HP up off its Sash and get a speed drop on the Gastrodon, which isn't significant in this context because Yveltal is significantly faster already naturally, but it allows me to double into the Gastrodon slot and pick up a double KO because of the special defense drops, leaving me with a 3-1 advantage at the end versus just a lone Incineroar, which can be threatening, but in this context, it's just not strong enough to be able to handle all 3, as even after the berry recovery, it's left at 50%, and the Thunder Punch only does about 50% back, meaning that with Bulldoze, it's too slow, and Yveltal being able to keep itself alive on Oblivion Wing. The Incend can't do enough damage, and the first game goes to me in a 3-1 fashion. I felt like this was a really, really good option, and I felt like if I wanted to, I could go back into it in game 2, but I felt that also the adjustment of an earlier max from Rye to not let me get going as much could throw a wrench in things, so I decided to mix it up going into game 2. So to start game 2, I decided that with the offensive lead of game 1 going so well for me, I would go with a opposite offensive lead this time to counter any kind of switches that he made into his lead to try to adjust. And he does exactly that. He changes his lead. As I send in my Solgaleo Entei, he changes his lead to Luxray and Gastrodon. This gives him a much better option into the Yveltal, but it gives him a much worse option into Solgaleo and Entei. So I felt like I was in a really good position with this lead. Entei is able to immediately get the Bulldoze off and proc my own policy, drop the speeds, and I get a Quake into the Luxray to immediately remove it from the field. And much similar to last game, I take an immediate lead. Now I do get a fortunate stroke of luck as the Gastrodon Hydro Pump misses after turn 1, leaving me with almost full HP on both Mons and getting a KO essentially for free on the Luxray. So now my question becomes, do I opt to switch the Entei out to try to reset the Sash, or do I continue to try to Bulldoze to keep myself in speed control? When he goes into the Incineroar, I see that that's a perfect time for me to try to get a switch, so I do. I remove the Entei and throw in Stonehenge. This now gives me a very powerful Solgaleo, who's at +2 attack and also essentially Life Orb boosted, meaning that this max Quake into the Incineroar does do enough to one-shot it from full HP, which is huge. It really helped me make sure that I was in full position. Now, thankfully, he did have double Intimidate, but thankfully my abilities were able to block that with full Metal Body on Solgaleo and Inner Focus on Entei. I wasn't worried at all about the Intimidate, which really helped me go into this in a more fearless manner and get the offensive start that I needed. Gastrodon once again Hydro Pumps into the Stonehenge slot, taking it down to Sash, very similar to how it went in game 1. And then he goes into his Calyrex, which I am now concerned about because I don't have speed control, right? So I have the option of Wide Guard if I need it in order to try to block the non-max attacks. But given how he's played this game, you assume he's going to max the Calyrex as his final option, and that's exactly what he does. He gets out the Calyrex and immediately maxes it. I'd go for the Wide Guard anyways, just to try to cover my options. I am +2 special defense, so I feel good about my chances of even taking a max Ghost because of the buffs that I got from doing 2 Quakes prior to its entry. But fortunately, Rai, as a newer player, attempts to go for a speed drop, but Solgaleo blocks it with his ability, and Darkness is enough to take it down to a Sash. I was running Crunch on Solgaleo specifically for this in the event that I got into a situation where I needed to face the Calyrex. I felt a lot more comfortable having something that could really just tear through it. Now, it does take it down to Sash, and the Blizzard gets blocked as he tries to pick up the Stonehenge and get a little bit of extra chip on the Solgaleo. It gets blocked by the Wide Guard, so it ends up being a good thing that I did Wide Guard with the Stonehenge. Now, I lose my max, but he still has turns of his max left. So at this point, I'm now in a little bit more of an awkward position because a max Ghost into me is going to do a ton of damage. Unfortunately for him, he does not opt to go for that option, instead going for another strike, trying to get speed control on his side. And the Earthquake, blocked by Wide Guard on my Stonehenge, does enough to pick up the Calyrex and take the Gastrodon down to a lower HP number, where after another missed Hydro Pump, the next turn, Wide Guard and Earthquake is enough to pick it up and give me a 4-0 win in Game 2 to win the set 2-0 and move to 2-0 on the season. I was pretty happy with how this team went from paper to execution. I think there was a lot of good things about it that I could apply outside and actually have been playing. I've been prepping my regional team around this Yveltal Entei Solgaleo core because I think it's a really, really fun option, and I'm really excited to do more with it. So next we're going to look at the game between No Shame in Losing and the Los Angeles Chargebugs. This next match is a really interesting one for the sake of the standings, as both of these teams were the only ones that meet in Week 2 that both had won in Week 1. We've got Kat repping the No Shame in Losing and Wyatt repping the Los Angeles Chargebugs. Both of these teams have really interesting modes, really interesting options, and have a lot of flexibility in how they're run, which is what makes them so scary. Kat has the Sun Core with Groudon and Charizard, as well as Zacian, which is arguably the strongest Pokemon in the format and possibly ever, as well as really good outside options like Gothitelle for trapping, Thundurus for powerful support, and even Jellicent is a really tanky physical wall. While Wyatt, on the other hand, has options for Trick Room with like Calyrex and Amoonguss, has Baton Pass and Topsy-Turvy on the Malamar as options, Speed Swap with the Pheromosa, as well as Tailwind from the Talonflame, giving him all sorts of speed control options and a bunch of scary ways that he can get rolling, mainly with that Calyrex. So both of these players look to get in front and kind of just roll using a specific singular Pokemon. So it's going to be a kind of battle of strengths in a way. So in game 1, both teams lead their strength. Wyatt leads out the Malamar Talonflame to give himself speed options, to give himself options to get his Calyrex in with pre-existing buffs. A lot of really, really scary options that you don't really want to let just roll out of control because it can really dogpile and become an issue. Whereas Kat runs her really scary duo of Gothitelle and Zacian. This duo traps you in to a Mon that's very, very strong, very, very scary, and doesn't give you an option of like retreating out to a defensive option, right? So if you lead wrong, you can get in trouble. It also gives stuff like Fake Out Pressure. It gives a counter Trick Room option, which Kat desperately needs with the team that she's running. So it's a very solid all-around lead that can go pretty well into whatever. It's the same lead that she went with twice last week as she won 2-0. So it's a proven, tried and true strategy that's very, very scary. Now on this first turn, she attempts to go for the Fake Out to try to stop the Tailwind from going up, but a Quick Guard comes out from the Talonflame, which is a really, really neat tech to protect specifically against stuff like that, to keep it alive. Now that she does double into the Talonflame, so it gets a little bit of damage on it and loses its priority status on its flying type moves. But the Malamar ends the turn unharmed and gets a Topsy-Turvy off on the Zacian to drop its attack to -1, which is significant on that Zacian. Anytime you can drop its attack, it's very, very valuable. So now Wyatt has a really good position and uses it to take position while Kat pivots. Kat takes out the Zacian and gets in her Charizard, trying to reset those buffs on Zacian and get Charizard into a advantageous position, while Wyatt gets the Tailwind set up and starts going for speed. Superpowering into the Charizard, which doesn't do a ton of damage, but is mostly there for the buffs. While Gothitelle then gets a Foul Play just to get a little bit of extra damage in on the Talonflame, get it below half health. So at this point, Wyatt's now got a buffed Malamar plus Tailwind, with the option of Baton passing out into the Calyrex or trying to find some kind of offensive presence on the field with the Charizard. Kat, on the other hand, has the Charizard in position and can switch in the Sun if she wants to max and start doing damage, or can pivot into something else trying to, reposition. She opts to do exactly that and switch in the Sun, give herself damage right away. Wyatt goes for his other interesting piece of tech that he hasn't shown off yet, of defog into the Malamar slot. What that does is it raises the Malamar evasion because of the contrary ability, meaning that if he's able to then switch it out and get the baton pass, he can get his Calyrex in with an evasion buff. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out, as the superpower goes in, gets another buff, but in the Sun, the Wildfire is enough to one-shot the Malamar, and there is no baton pass to be had. That ends up being a really, really big knockout for Kat, as the speed is still out of her control, but the offensive pressure is. She now has her Charizard and Sun, and the only real offensive option that Wyatt has left is this Calyrex, which does not want to take a hit. So her goal is very simple. Get rid of the Calyrex, which Wyatt wisely Dynamaxes and max guards in order to try to protect as well as he can, try to see if he can clear the Charizard from the board before it becomes a massive threat. He Brave Birds the Charizard. It does a good chunk, but not quite enough. The double goes into the Calyrex. That ends up being a really, really good turn for Wyatt, as they tried to clear the Calyrex from the board right away, but were unable to because of the max guard. But it ends up not being enough, as Charizard lives the Brave Bird, and the max Wildfire is enough to one-shot the Dynamax Calyrex. And the Fire Punch does pick up the Talonflame as well. The Solar Power recoil ends up killing the Charizard, and you are left with Gothitelle and Groudon versus Pheromosa, which is a very, very difficult matchup to play around, because the Pheromosa is not running Protect, so it can just be faked out, and it has very little bulk, meaning the Fire Punch is able to pick it up and win Cat game 1 in a 3-1. This feels like a one-sided game. It's a 6-turn 3-1 that feels very one-sided, but at the same time, it's one of those where if the Malamar could have survived a turn, or if the Talonflame could have picked up the Charizard, it very easily could have been a 3-1 in the other direction. I think this was a really close game, and it was really well played by both people. It just ended up being that the Sun Charizard was too much to overcome. Wyatt just didn't have quite enough damage output with the 4 that he brought to be able to deal with that Charizard specifically. With how close game 1 was, game 2, both players kind of opt to run back the same idea, hoping to just play a little bit differently and flip the tide in their favor, right? So the same leads come out, the Malamar and Talonflame on Wyatt's side versus the Zacian and Gothitelle on Cat's side. I think this is the best lead that both of these players had, given what they brought to the games. I would have liked to see Dracovish come for Wyatt, but I also understand in the matchup with the Sun and with Zacian, if you don't get the Tailwind up, it's very easy to remove, and it can kind of snowball from there if you don't use that as your primary offensive mon. So he elects to go with the safer option, the one that nearly was able to bring him game 1, and he goes back to the well again with Malamar. This time it works a little bit worse, as he opts to not Quick Guard, trying to go for a Tailwind early and get the immediate setup off, maybe hoping to have faked out with the game 1 Quick Guard that Cat wouldn't go for another fake out, but in this case she does. She doubles down into it and kills the Malamar in turn 1, meaning that Wyatt loses one of his best offensive mons while not doing any damage on the first turn, which ends up being very, very costly. The Calyrex does come in, and rather than Dynamax, it stays small and goes for a high horsepower into the Calyrex, living the Behemoth Blade because of its Babiri Berry, which is the same item that it ran last week to counter Snooze's Dialga. It survives and is able to give a very, very strong high horsepower back. Unfortunately, it's not enough to KO, And I'm torn on this play because I really like the idea from Wyatt of trying to keep the spread pressure on, but at the same time, Calyrex is his only real Dynamax option in this team, and he really, really needs it to be able to survive and do damage. So while the Behemoth Blade wouldn't do as much damage, or would do the same amount of damage, the returning high horsepower would have been enough to KO if it was a max Quake instead. So it's one of those plays where you look back on it and you might go, I could have played that differently. I think he still gets a very good opportunity here late, but it's one that you can look back on and kind of go, I can see both sides of it, right? You can understand why that play was played the way it was. You can understand why it might be beneficial to play it in a different manner. Because the Imprison was Cat's option against Trick Room in the event that he tried to set it up. He does not, therefore he's able to essentially null that turn from the Gothitelle, forcing a switch out, as the Gothitelle doesn't really have a good option into what the Tailwind is doing for Wyatt right now. So she opts to switch into the Charizard, trying to get the offensive pressure back, possibly expecting a max or something else, I'm not sure. Zacian protects, eats the Brave Bird, but the Glacial Lance does massive damage into this Charizard. And this is where the non-maxing bet almost pays off for Wyatt. If he's able to pick up the Charizard here, he probably wins this game. But it lives on 2% HP, just a sliver, and ends up being able to survive the turn long enough from the Brave Bird into the Zacian to get a Heat Wave off and KO the Calyrex from 45%, which knocks itself out in the process, but takes Wyatt's biggest offensive threat off the field and leaves him with two Mons who, while scary in their own rights, aren't exactly meant to be offensive pressure versus still a very, very strong Pokemon in Groudon. So it comes down to a later turn. Now, this I think is a really good play from Cat to note that there are very, very fast, very threatening options on the field and Trick Room them. Now her Groudon and her Gothitelle are able to kind of run away with this game, right? Neither player has used their max, so Cat opts to do so right away. Going into the Pheromosa Protect with a double, Foul Play and Max Flare. The Max Flare is not quite enough to pick it up through the Protect, but does do a huge chunk of damage. Talonflame gets a Brave Bird into the Gothitelle, which eats his berry to get back to 50%. The Pheromosa attempts to max in order to just stall out the Trick Room turns. It cannot. The Foul Play goes in, knocks it down to 1%. It barely survives. The Flare goes into the Talonflame, kills it, and then one more Foul Play is enough to pick up the Pheromosa and win Cat this game 2-0 and move her as well to 2-0, still having not dropped a game. So definitely the team to watch for in this league is this one here. Very, very scary, lots of good options, and performing very, very well. So our last game of the week we're going to go on to is Madbro and the Buizel Boys versus Kick for Life and Kick for Life. Which one of those is the team and which one's the player? I'll let you decide. The last matchup of the week adds a lot of intrigue as a newer player has a really, really powerful on-paper matchup into a more experienced veteran player. So seeing how that veteran player can try to play around the tricky parts of the matchup as Madbro tries to work around the Rain and the Kyogre and the very scary Palkia, Grimmsnarl options as well. While Ash doesn't let the power of his team get to his head and, you know, throw him off as he tries to compete against a really high-level opponent like Madbro. So for game one, Madbro actually flips the script a little bit his team, which normally on paper looks like a very defensive, slow play team, comes out with a very offensive lead of Urshifu Dark and Togedemaru, while Ash opts for the speedy Rain lead of Crobat and Kyogre. That gives him very, very scary options with Tailwind, with either Water Spout or Max Kyogre, while it also gives him, as Madbro learns on turn 1, it gives him Fake Out Protection, as the Crobat is running Inner Focus as its ability, so it can't get faked out and ends up getting the Tailwind. Now, this is something that I've talked to Ash about. He likes to mix up his moves a little bit when he's playing, especially with a Maxmon. And with Kyogre, I've kind of told him that he doesn't need to do that, as a Geyser and Rain would be doing massive damage. He opts to Hailstorm into the Togedemaru, does a little bit of damage, and the Urshifu comes back, hits him very hard with a Max Lightning, and puts him in kind of a back foot position now, because he does have Tailwind, he does have very scary pressure, but he's also no longer in his Rain, and is forced to kind of pivot, as his Kyogre has already taken a massive chunk of damage. Fortunately, turn 2 goes much better for him, as the Brave Bird from the Crobat and the Max Geyser from the Kyogre is enough to KO the Urshifu. The Nuzzle goes into the Crobat, paralyzes it, but it does survive. So he ends up now with a very fast Kyogre back in its Rain, back where it feels strongest, and a Crobat, which, while it is paralyzed, it's also in Tailwind, so it still maintains a little bit of that speed, and it survives for another turn, letting him kind of play the long game with these next few turns. Madbro opts to get in Lunala, hoping to maybe survive the turn and then have wide guard pressure for the Kyogre if it goes back to non-max for the Origin Pulses or whatever else it opts to use. Ash goes for a Max Lightning here, which does do a decent chunk because of the terrain, and a Mean Look, which unfortunately does not work on Ghost types, so it fails. That's, again, tech that you don't always know right off the top of your head, but is a good learning experience. I like the idea of trying to trap in the Restricted into a matchup that it might not want to stay in for very long on. Make sure that you can pick up that KO, because that's a really scary offensive threat for the rest of your team. But the double into the Kyogre is enough to KO it. So Ash opts to go into the Grimmsnarl, giving him a lot of different pressures, as well as something like Foul Play to help deal with the Lunala. Now, what ends up happening instead is he Thunder Waves, trying to get the speed back on his side, and the Brave Bird actually crits into the Lunala. I don't know how significant of a crit that is. I don't, again, run the numbers on it, but it ends up doing massive damage to Lunala, finishes it off in one shot, also knocks out the Crobat in the process, meaning he gets a free switch in afterwards into his Palkia in the back. So now he's in an advantage position, right? He's got his Grimmsnarl and his Palkia in Rain, in his weather, against a Landorus and a Togedemaru. It can still be a precarious situation because Landorus is very strong, and Togedemaru has speed options with like Nuzzle. But as it turns out, the strength is not quite enough. The Nuzzle does not land into the Protect, and the Rock Slide does not KO the Grimmsnarl. Foul Play is enough to knock the Landorus down to very low HP. And while the Palkia does get paralyzed the next turn, and the Superpower comes through, it's not enough to protect them, as the Earth Power is enough to easily pick up the Togedemaru, and another Foul Play takes out the Landorus, meaning that Ash wins game 1, 2-0 over Madbro, and shows off a little bit of the interesting ideas that he had. I think both players played it really differently from how I expected them to. I expected Palkia to be the primary Maxmon in this team, but instead opting for Kyogre, while Mad Bro, rather than playing it slowly, goes for the quick offensive pressure. I think also probably expecting that the Kyogre would not immediately max, which had that read paid off, he would have been able to KO it turn 1. So it's an unfortunate read that doesn't pay off, but in a hard matchup, I think both players played really well and gave themselves good chances to win. So after a really close game 1, both players mix it up a little bit with their leads in game 2. Mad Bro going with a little bit more supportive, defensive-minded option with the Lapras and the Mewtwo, where he has options to max the Lapras and get his screens up right away, or he can use the Lapras as a diversion and try to set up the Mewtwo and maybe max that the next turn, while Ash, on the other hand, tries to go with his Kyogre that worked very well for him in game 1, got a lot of damage on the board, and the Grimmsnarl this time to help support, give paralysis options, give just kind of, you know, that mess up your game plan kind of gameplay that Grimmsnarl is so good at with Prankster. So expecting, I think, a max Lapras turn 1, Ash decides to not go for the Mewtwo slot and instead attempts to attack the Lapras slot, which does not Dynamax, and instead Helping Hands into the Mewtwo. A really interesting tech there to make sure that you have both options with this lead. No matter what gets thrown off at you, you can kind of adjust, right? The Thunder Wave does go into the Mewtwo, which makes it go after the Kyogre, which normally would really harm it, but the Max Lightning is not enough to KO the Lapras, and it actually sets up Electric Terrain, which means that the Kyogre takes a massive hit instead, and nearly KOs in one hit through the Dynamax. So that's massive, massive damage on the Kyogre, and puts Kick in a very, very bad position overall, because he doesn't want to lose his Maxmon this early. Now, Mad Bro goes for what's a really, really risky play, but I think is a really, really smart play at the same time. If it works and it pays off, it could really, really like win you this game. He opts to max his very, very low HP Lapras in order to try to see if he can get those screens up. If he fails, he loses his Dynamax for basically nothing. But if he succeeds, it means that his backline Mons can survive more hits and more scary things and allow him to maybe roll in the late game, right? And it pays off because Ash decides to max Geyser into the Mewtwo slot instead of picking up the KO on the Lapras. The Lapras does get the Resonance off in order to get its screens up and lives the foul play from the Grimmsnarl because of that. So now you do have screens up, and both Dynamax Mons are very, very low HP. So you're in kind of a precarious situation on both sides, right? You don't want to lose your big Dynamax Pokemon too early, but you don't want to mix up and, you know, throw away the game by playing overly safe, overly defensive, whatever. So Mad Bro opts to go into Urshifu, trying to bring that offensive pressure back onto the board, especially for that Kyogre. Max guards the Lapras just to play it safe, make sure that he's able to keep both of his Mons throughout this turn. Ash, unfortunately, falls prey to the Prankster Dark type change and tries to Thunder Wave into the Urshifu, which does not work, and the Thunder Punch is able to KO the Kyogre and put Mad Bro into a rather advantageous position here. Mad Bro still has his other restricted left alive, as does Ash, but the disparity in screens helps Mad Bro out a lot. The Venusaur comes in here, giving him a really interesting option, but unfortunately, another instance of a newer player not knowing some of the more complicated mechanics. The Electric Terrain actually protects Lunala on the switch from the Sleep Powder, which is costly, as the Max Mindstorm from the Lapras actually would have changed the terrain and put the Lunala to sleep had it been faster than the Venusaur. So it ends up being a very unfortunate misplay, as the Venusaur takes massive damage and the Lunala gets to switch in almost for free. It does take the Spirit Break, and it does get the special defense or special attack drop, which is significant for it, but it gets in with very little damage on, which is the most significant thing for it. Now the Dynamax runs out, and both players are in kind of a weird spot. They have a more supportive option with Lunala and Grimmsnarl at high health, and they have a offensive option with very low health with Venusaur and Lapras. So they're both kind of in this weird position, but Madbro is behind screens, which is a really big benefit to him, and goes for the Icy Wind and actually tries to double into the Venusaur here with a Icy Wind and Zen Headbutt, but the Venusaur dies to the Icy Wind, meaning the Zen Headbutt goes in for nothing. Foul Play does massive damage into the Lunala, even through the screens, because of the 4x weakness, making it a very, very scary option, making it something that now all of a sudden, Madbro does have 3 Pokemon left, but only the Urshifu has high health, and the Urshifu is not something that you want to be counting on for tanking hits. It's known to be, especially on the special side, very frail. So you have a lot of low HP Pokemon left trying to just finish it out. Now, this also shows the weakness policy on the Lunala, which I think is a really, really interesting tech to have on what's normally more of a, supportive restricted. Madbro opts to instead go for a weakness policy option with some very strong offensive pressure. Unfortunately, because it's not Dynamaxed and because it's so low HP, it's kind of in a bad position to try to take advantage of that. Plus, the early Spirit Break knocked it down. The Moongeist Beam does almost pick up the KO on the Palkia because of the Helping Hand, but the Palkia is able to pick up that KO right back, and the Foul Play is able to kill the Lapras. So now you're left with a 2v1 with Palkia and Grimmsnarl against the Urshifu. Unfortunately, Grimmsnarl is just a very rough wall for the Urshifu and something that it can't really get around. Also, another mechanic that Ash doesn't get right away that it doesn't end up costing him, fortunately, but he protects in front of the Urshifu. The Wicked Blow is not enough. The Spirit Break does a massive amount of damage, takes it down to 1 HP on the Sash, and Ash actually gets the double protect on the Palkia, but the Thunder Punch is not enough either, and the Spirit Break is enough to KO the Urshifu and win Ash Game 2, giving Kick for Life the 2-0 win over Madbro and the Weasel Boys to finish out the rest of our week. So that's all for this week. 3 games, actually 3 2-0s. Not much for the close games this week, but a lot of exciting stuff. And honestly, all of the games, even though they were 2-0s, were mostly close games, very exciting games that could have gone either way. So I'm really excited to see what we have going forward and where these teams continue to grow. And as people get more and more comfortable using their teams and understanding where they all go, I think there's going to be some really, really cool options and some really interesting stuff that's shown. So if you want to see more of that, you want to, experience the rest of these games, again, drop that sub, give me the like, the follows, the whatevers, I don't know, you know the ones. I don't do YouTube, I do Twitch. Speaking of, if you see the name, you see the overlay, I stream on Twitch 4 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. So if you are interested in seeing more content from me, I do a variety of games over there. I do some competitive Pokemon, I do some other, different stuff. I would love to see you over there. And otherwise, I will see you next week for the recap of week 3. Hope you all have a great one. Bye-bye.